This sermon is titled The Shepherd. It was preached on April 26, 2015, the fourth Sunday in Easter. The sermon title is The Shepherd, and it references John 10, verses 11 through 18, where Jesus describes himself as the Good Shepherd. He wakes up just as the sun is peeking over the mountains to the east, just as he's done every morning for the last few months. He takes a few minutes to drink in the beauty of his surroundings, but he quickly knows that he's got to get to work. And so he takes a quick trip around the low stone wall that surrounds the sheep pen, making sure that the wall is still secure and everything is as he left it. He stops at the narrow hole in the wall where the sheep gate is, and he checks the piles of briars that he's piled there to stop anything from getting in. The sheep begin to stir as he walks around, and one by one they walk over to the gate to begin their day. With all the sheep accounted for after a good, safe night, his first task that day is to make sure that they have a good long drink of clean water. He's planned this last night, so he knows the direction that he's going to go. He's found the safest path to take. And he knows in this countryside there are no real safe paths to take, which is why he's filled the pouch on his belt with small rocks and smooth river stones. The sling and stones are the same that were used to slay the giant Goliath by David. But he knows that they're pretty effective against predators like mountain lions, and like other experienced shepherds, he's a crack shot with his sling. He carries his crook, this long staff with a hook on the end of it. It's not just for show. It's not a badge of office. It's not so that everybody will know that he's a shepherd. This stick is a second line of defense against any intruder, any wild animal, any thief who is determined to make off with a sheep or two. And a quick thump on the head with that solid piece of wood are quickly going to convince any attacker that they need to look someplace else. And the hook? Well, there are many times that the shepherd has to move his flock from one place to another, from one grazing area to another. And not all of those grazing areas are linked by nice, smooth paths. Oftentimes, they'll have to go through wooded areas where predators hide in the shadows. Oftentimes, they'll have to walk through the hills and mountains where cliff paths with sheer drops, or paths that border along ravines and gullies, mean that if a sheep were to lose its footing, it would fall off the path. And it did happen. Every now and then a sheep would miss its step and fall. What the shepherd would do was reach down and use his staff like a long fishing pole, and like a fish hook, he would wrap the hook at the end of the staff around the leg of the poor sheep and gently lift him back up. As he leads his flock to water, he's trying to avoid any of these nasty surprises. Last night, before he went to sleep, he walked around to make sure that he found the safest path possible so that he can get this flock to water as safely and as quickly as possible. And it's not only important to find the safest path, but he's got to find the right watering hole. If they fall into the water, they're going to soak it up like a sponge, and sheep aren't particularly good swimmers, especially not now that their woolly coats are really beginning to fill out. And he may not be able to use his shepherd's crook to rescue these sheep from the water. He knows this land well, and he's found the perfect spot right next to a beautiful green pasture where the sheep are going to graze today. While the sheep are enjoying their morning drink, the shepherd walks around the nearby pasture, and he stops and closely examines every inch of ground. He stops to pick up sharp stones and briars and thorns that might cut the soft noses of the sheep. He looks for those plants that are going to be poisonous or could cause them illness. He looks for scorpions and snakes, insect nests, anything that's going to harm the flock as they innocently graze in this place. There are enemies everywhere, and it is his responsibility to prepare their dinner table right in the middle of it all. After they've had their fill of water, the sheep begin to run in the pasture and settle in for a normal day of doing what sheep do. The shepherd finds a nice shade tree where he can keep an eye on the pasture, keeping one eye alert for any danger to the flock. One of the things that he's watching for today is to make sure that none of the sheep wander off. You know, sometimes a sheep would find a really great area, a patch of grass, and with her head down, she'd just keep eating and walking until she's followed this path away from where the shepherd can watch over her. If that single sheep gets far enough away from the shepherd, from his sling and from his staff, it becomes the perfect victim for enemies hiding nearby. The rest of the flock are relatively safe together, and so the shepherd focuses his effort on searching for this one lost sheep. But fortunately today, it's just over the next hill and is easily found. Once in a while, the shepherd might find a sheep that doesn't belong to his flock, one that's wandered off from its own group. In that case, he would incorporate this lost sheep into his own group until he can find its true owner. Any lost sheep would be welcomed into the fold. No one sheep is left to stand and face danger alone. What's amazing to me is that none of these sheep are actually his own. It's pretty common that shepherds didn't own the sheep that they cared for. Some did, but that was the exception rather than the rule. Most shepherds spent their time taking care of other people's animals. At the beginning of the grazing season, the shepherd would go from farm to farm to farm, from sheep owner to sheep owner, and collect them so that he would be responsible for their safety, and he would be ultimately responsible for their safe return. And when they returned, they would be fat and healthy and covered in valuable wool. And the shepherd would then reap the reward of his hard work. And if he lost any sheep, the cost of that animal would be taken out of his reward. But more importantly, the shepherd that lost sheep would be seen as untrustworthy, and he'd quickly find himself without owners willing to hire him. Protecting these animals is more than just a financial issue. The shepherd who didn't protect his flock was not a shepherd. He might be considered a hired hand, someone who's paid to do a job but didn't really care if the work was done to the best of his abilities. But if this man wants to truly be a shepherd, he knows that he has got to take care of each and every sheep as if they were his own, even if that means risking his life to protect them. Even if it means standing with his sling or his staff and putting his body physically between the animals and the danger. In the path of an attacking mountain lion or dealing with a band of thieves. If he did not protect his flock, then he was not a shepherd. And like many jobs, there's no great visible reward for being a shepherd. The pay's fine, but it's not enough to build a comfortable home. And really, since he spends so much time away from the animals, taking care of a nice home is just not a realistic expectation. Shepherding is not a job that earns high levels of respect in the community, other than maybe from other sheep owners or other shepherds. Most shepherds were really good with their sheep, but they're not necessarily that great with people. And that's probably why they enjoy spending so much time away from the rest of the community. Shepherds were always a part of the community, but they were never really a central part. They were merely seen as a group of people who took care of other people's animals. And as our shepherd sits under the shade tree, an interesting thing happens. Throughout the day, one by one, the sheep would move apart from the flock and move over to the shepherd. And he would quietly talk with them, maybe scratch them behind the ear or rub their belly, because he knows what each animal likes. And after a few minutes of attention, the sheep would return to their flock and continue their day. The sheep know the shepherd's voice, and they can tell his voice apart from any other. Even in the confusion of two shepherds and two flocks meeting on a path, the sheep know their shepherd's voice and will easily follow them because he was their shepherd. And as the sun begins to fade late in the afternoon, the shepherd leads the flock once again down to still waters and then back to the sheepfold. And as the sheep line up to enter the narrow gate, the shepherd kneels down next to them and he examines them one by one. He calls them by name. He maybe rubs some healing oil on their soft noses where there are any scratches or cuts that they've gotten during the day. And after each sheep is back in the fold, the shepherd piles the briars up again in the narrow gateway, and he walks around the stone wall and deals with any loose stones and piles some more briars on top to make sure that any predator cannot get within the walls. And only then, after seeing that his flock is safe and secure for the night, does the shepherd find a comfortable spot in the little stone tower he's built nearby, and he settles in for the night. As he does through the day, he spends the night with one eye watching over his flock, keeping a sharp lookout for anything that threatens his sheep, because it's what he does. When the sun comes up the following morning, it is a different day than the pattern that they've been living in. It's the end of the grazing season, and after checking each of the sheep, he leads them from the still waters through a long dusty path back down into the city, and one by one he presents each of the owners with his animals. He felt the weight of the pouch that he carries, no longer filled with small rocks and smooth river stones. It's filled with the reward for what he's done. But more than that, he feels the warmth knowing that he has done what he set out to do. He has taken care of each and every sheep. He's no hired hand. He is a shepherd. And as he makes his way back to his humble home, he notices that there are a group of people standing down by the sea. And they're there gathered in a bunch, sitting and standing, listening to one man who's talking to them. And as he walks nearer, he remembers all the things that he's heard about this man, this teacher. And as a shepherd, he doesn't really care for things like prophets or miracle workers. His main concern is his sheep. And don't misunderstand me. He's a man of faith. You've got to have a strong faith to put yourself in front of real danger, holding only a sling and a stick. But his faith is not the kind of faith that requires a lot of debate or even talking about. You stand up to your enemies or you don't. It's pretty basic. He stands at the back of the crowd, more out of curiosity than anything else. And he finds himself being drawn into the crowd closer and closer so that he can hear what this teacher is saying better. And he finds himself in a strange position. He's in the middle of a group of men who are dressed in stylish robes and covered in fine linen and jewels. And they smell like they have been rubbed on with expensive perfume. And they are all looking at this man with disgust. He's as clean as any man that has spent the past months living in the mountains with his sheep could be. But he's not covered in expensive robes. He doesn't smell like perfumed oil. And so these priests, in comparison, make him feel like he stands out in this crowd even more. Maybe it's the look that these priests give the shepherd. Or maybe it's the hesitance that he sees in the shepherd's eyes. But whatever it is that catches the speaker's attention, he says at this point, looking directly at this small group, "I am the good shepherd." And he looks directly at our poor shepherd, and he goes on and says things like, "The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. I lay down my life for my sheep." And then his gaze drifts from the shepherd to the group of priests, and he says, "The hired hand, who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away." And he goes on and says, "The hired hand doesn't care for the sheep." And every eye on the crowd is now on this small cluster of people, the rich and powerful perfumed priest and the fresh from the hills shepherd. And they are waiting to see what happens next, because you can cut the tension in the air with a knife. It's obvious that Jesus has struck a nerve somewhere. The priests who were so smug and self-satisfied earlier now have looks of anger and hatred as they begin to try to figure out who it is they're going to kill first. This little sheep herder or this rabble-rousing preacher. And before they can even make up their minds, Jesus pushes things just one point further. He says, "So there will be one flock, one shepherd." No, he's got the priest's attention now. They're no longer even listening to what he says. They have already made up their mind. In a matter of seconds, Jesus has declared that he is the shepherd and of more value than the priests. The shepherd is trustworthy. The priest is nothing more than a hired hand. And one flock? You can forget about it. Religious law is clear, and there is a distinction between those who are clean and those who are unclean. There's not one flock. There never would be. They were the leaders of the true flock. They had the power and authority. They were going to make sure that it continued to happen that way. And they look at the shepherd and they see him as harmless and meaningless and of no real threat. The threat is in front of them. And with a look of blood in their eyes, they glare at this preacher who has called himself the Good Shepherd. And they decide that he has to go. While all of this is burning through the minds of the priests and scribes and Pharisees, the shepherd moves calmly back through the crowd, already thinking about the work that has to be done. He has sheep to collect. He's got to take them back to the hills and care for them, because that's what the Good Shepherd does.